I'd like to kick off with a question, if I could, and maybe ask Mark first. I'll make a statement first. When I was growing up, we knew what the public broadcaster was. It was cricket on the radio. It was news and current affairs at 6 o'clock. It was, if we were in the bush, and my family were in the bush, it was midday getting the country hour on radio. It was getting the reports on stock prices. It was an essential thing in the house. And when transistor radios were bought, we could listen to the cricket and those things in the cabin. Well, we didn't have cabins in tractors those days, but on the farm. There were no other services that provided that. But I'm looking at my family these days, and one of them's got an air-conditioned tractor where he's got his laptop and he's got his Telstra thing poked in the side, and he's reading the Wall Street Journal. And for cricket, he can just stream from the BBC rather than listen to the ABC if he wants to. It seemed to me back then there was an essentiality about the public broadcast. It was an essential part of our lives. With the digital age, is that fundamentally changing?
No, I think there's still an essential role for public broadcasting in this digital era. We were formed in an era of paucity of media, as you suggest. There were relatively few broadcasters, even though in contrast to the BBC, we were never a monopolist. I mean, the ABC, when radio started for us in 1932, there were commercial radio stations. When television started in 1956, there were commercial television stations. We've always had a mixed model here. But fundamentally, we were created because there wasn't enough media about, and there was a question as to whether the market could provide that, and there was a sense of market failure. I would argue that the market failure arguments are just as strong now in this era of media plenty as it was in the era of media scarcity. With global provision of content, with audiences being fragmented everywhere, with audiences having so much choice, it is going to be increasingly difficult for the market to be able to deliver some things that the market traditionally did deliver. And if I can just point out three areas that I think we can see now. One is serious news and current affairs. If you are a commercial television network and you are trying to maximise the return on your hour of broadcasting, then investing in quality, long-form current affairs like Four Corners is not how you do it. And I think if the ABC wasn't there, it would not necessarily be in commercial networks' interest at all to create programs like the 7:30 Report and Four Corners and Foreign Correspondent and Late Line. That's not a commercial play. That's a play of the ABC fulfilling its charter. And just because there are lots of channels now doesn't make it more viable. In fact, it makes it less viable to deliver that content. I think Australian drama is another area that at $1 million an hour to create, it is hard in this era of fragmented markets to be able to demonstrate that it won't be tougher and tougher to get a commercial return on some of that activity. So again, a role for public broadcasting. And you mentioned the bush. You go to regional and rural Australia, the ABC is more important the further it gets away from Sydney, the further it gets away from Ultimo, because it's harder and harder for commercial markets to be able to monetise and get the return they need on capital in those areas. So I think it's gone, from meeting need in an era of scarcity to meeting need in an era of plenty. But the need is there, and I think the gaps that the market is going to struggle to deliver on are ever growing, and so therefore the role of public broadcasting is ever stronger in that environment.
So fundamentally it's an economic argument than a commercial argument that you're addressing market failure through being able to sustain programming that complements, if you like, or
our charter talks about programming of specialist interest and wide appeal. So it's never simply been a case that we broadcast what no one else wants to broadcast. But there are a few things we have very much in mind. One is that we reach every Australian home. The ABC reaches 99% of the Australian population. So this argument that something's on cable, so we shouldn't do it, is not relevant to us. Cable is only available in 30% of Australian homes. We're available in every Australian home. So we look for programs of specialist appeal, programs of broad interest, but of course we operate under a charter, and there are a variety of specialist areas that we have a responsibility to deliver on that will never win the ratings, but absolutely pass the test of being something that only the ABC can deliver, or the SBS can deliver, but space for the public broadcasters to operate in.
Sure.
Well, I agree. I'd probably go a little further and say that the fragmenting market created by the digital revolution justifies even greater investment in public broadcasting, because in the plethora of voices, many of them from externally, justifies a strong national voices. And really, public broadcasting are the organisations most equipped and most likely to remain committed in the face of the changing market to that outcome. And why it's critical, I believe, for public broadcasting in this regard, I think it came clear to me reading the Digital Britain report and the role of the diminishing role of ITV, which, as you know, in the British model is regarded as a public broadcaster, although it's commercial and privately owned. It still is delivering a public good outcome, so in their language, that's a public broadcaster. But its ability to sustain the performance that it had over previous years was being damaged, and in the future you could see it being damaged even more so by the emerging multi-channels and more particularly emerging IPTV. So this would suck away the commercial revenues that has sustained and nurtured ITV and allowed it to invest in quality content and distinctive content. But what Digital Britain concluded, and I absolutely identify with, was that those organisations that were part of this fragmentation, this expansion, showed no appetite for investing their profits in quality content. And I think that will be an enduring feature over the next few years, and really look at multi-channels now and subscription channels as well, but on top of that, consider an IPTV future where anybody can come into the market offering the lowest possible cost option with the highest possible return, driven entirely by profit. And I think that there you have a case for saying ABC, SBS, and maybe more public broadcasting outlets are the pillars on which you build the national voice.
Okay, but there's a given in that, isn't there, that both the ABC and the SBS have to be properly funded to deliver on that charter and that landscape. And you and I have spoken about this for some time, and we're still on the job. Lord Puttnam, I understand that you can get the shipping news now as an app on iPod. Where does that put the Beeb?
I think it leaves the BBC in a perfectly strong place. I agree with everything that's been said, and all I would do really is add to it two additional issues, and then also throw in a question, I suppose. I think it's an issue of public trust. It comes down to what type of us. It's a big question that doesn't get asked, and doesn't get asked in Britain sufficiently, and I don't know the degree to which it gets asked in this country, is what type of a society do you actually want to live in? You start there, because unless you can answer that question, you can't even begin to engage with this issue. If you answer that question by saying, well, I want to live in a well-informed society, I want to live in a society which has sources of trust, and which in turn has to do with social justice, then you quite quickly come to a point that whilst if we started with a blank sheet of paper today, it would almost be impossible to invest, to create our version, I think, of public broadcasting. What we've ended up with is a public good, which is beyond price. Okay, it's beyond price because it establishes a cornerstone for public trust. A very simple question to ask yourself is, in the event of a national crisis, what button are you going to push for information? Again, you have to be able to answer that question for yourself. You're going to want a button that's going to be accurate, it's going to be trustworthy, it's going to be up to date. You are unlikely to push a button that's got an agenda attached to it. So you're looking for an agenda-free piece of information which will inform you as to what to do next with your life or in your life in a crisis. So that's where I think public trust and public service broadcasting comes into play. But there's another area which is the issue of innovation. I hope this is not going to relay back to him because he'll probably get pissed off, but one of my best and oldest friends is a very nice man indeed called Melvyn Bragg, who's a colleague of mine in the House of Lords. Melvyn recently, his programme has been going on for 30 years, the South Bank show was cancelled by ITV, and he's got himself a contract, and God bless him, with Sky. And we've had serious discussions about this, and that's fine. But what I constantly asked him is, would Sky have given a job to a programme called Book Club to a 28-year-old Oxford graduate called Melvyn Bragg? I doubt it. I don't blame Sky for buying off the shelf a brand, the Melvyn Bragg brand and a South Bank show brand. That's fine. But who's then going to provide the job for the next 28-year-old and the next innovative programme that we haven't heard of? Similarly with David Attenborough. David's just done a program on, again, I don't blame him at all, on dinosaurs, because the opportunity of 3D offered to do something very, very compelling. But I remember David when he was actually controller of BBC Two, with a hankering to do zoo programs, and the BBC were prepared to give him a shot. And unless you've got an organisation with both the guts and the breadth and the resources to take chances on people, to develop strands of programming, to develop people who become, in David Attenborough's case particularly, a national treasure. I mean, an absolute icon. You know, when David speaks about climate change, the climate change debate shifts because people really trust him. We don't have many people like that in Britain. Very, very few. I would guess there are less than half a dozen individuals in the whole of the country who people absolutely trust when it comes to complex and controversial issues. So where those people land becomes actually a centre of gravity for the nation. And 99 times out of 100 you will find that those people have emerged out of the public broadcasting system. Do away with that, you do away with public trust. Do away with public trust, you begin to basically cut away at the fundamentals of democracy. And my greatest single fear, I'm about to say it now, my greatest fear is that not so much my generation, the next generation, is going to be faced with trade-offs between the marketplace and democratic values. And it's where this society, my society in the UK, agrees those trade-offs, which will determine what type of society my grandchildren live in.
The US doesn't have it's got an NPR and this sort of quasi-government funded with private money. It doesn't have an established network of public broadcasters. The point you made...
I slightly argue with that. Yes. Because whilst it may not have a established public broadcasting, it has traditionally had the Dan Rathers of the world. Yes, it has had trusted sources. Yes. But they happen to have emerged within the network system. Yes. With the breakup in that network system, I happen to love Jon Stewart. Whether or not Jon Stewart is able to go on television and tell the American public that there is a national crisis and be believed, I'm not sure.
That's true. Well, I was coming to the point that you made earlier. Where do people turn to? It seemed to me that America is a very fragile place at the moment, especially after New Orleans. The news and the situation on the ground in New Orleans only came to us via commercial services in the first instance. And had a BBC or an ABC been in place, that whole situation could have been better reported, people would be more aware and alert, there would be more reaction time. What is it, do you think, about that side of the value of the public broadcaster, which is not fully appreciated or comprehended by government? It's always sort of in the background, but your point is right. When we have a national crisis, it is ABC Radio, is ABC TV, up until recently, Mark, when Sky launched its service. But it's an intriguing thing for me. I've never understood that. Well, the American system was developed commercially from the get-go, and I guess interests precluded a national voice, public voice in the middle of that. But I just want to relate to something, if I could just sidetrack. Back in 2003, when we were negotiating the free trade agreement, in the middle of that tough last stage, and Kim, where's Kim? Kim Dalton here. Kim was in the middle of this with the Prime Minister at the time over a particular weekend. One of our more senior negotiators, Dr. Milton Church, approached me and said, well, he said, Jeff, look, we've got to put something on the table to say we want the Yanks to do something if we're going to trade this off. And he said, what can we do that would give value? And I said, well, look, this is not only an Australian position, perhaps the world position. Get Congress to establish a bill for an SBS equivalent so we can get our pictures and our stories out there to make America a more sophisticated place. Pleased to say that Dr. Milton Church actually put that position in Washington. Didn't get too far with it, but he put it out there. Can I go a bit further? Touching on that news and current affairs in particular, and now the competition that's coming from, and the opposition that's coming from, especially the Murdoch organisation, News Limited, to both the Beeb and to the ABC, establishing online 24-hour presence for news and current affairs. How do we defend that position in the face of what he's saying? Is it the diversity plurality argument, or is it?
Well, I mean, the way I view it, I mean, we've tracked the comments of the Murdoch family through the generations here and found comments from Sir Keith Murdoch in the 1930s attacking the rights of the ABC to be broadcasting news, so at least they're consistent. But, and you know, I sometimes say that Dave will speak in the interest of their shareholders and I'll speak in the interest of our shareholders, and our shareholders are the Australian people. We have a charter for news, and our charter for news implores us to deliver news that is fair, balanced, impartial, and we adopt that charter to deliver news to Australians at a time they want, device they want, format they want. And if they want it at 7 o'clock at night, as they have for 50 years, we'll give it to them there. But if they want it streamed to their mobile phone, as more than 1 million Australians have downloaded the ABC iPhone app, so they can have it on their phone, we'll give it to them that way as well. And the prospect that some in News Limited would say to quarantine us into a little corner doesn't just weaken the ABC clearly, but it weakens the service and the options that are available to the Australian people. And I think the American example is a good one, in that back in the 60s, when there were those big networks there, someone like Walter Cronkite declaring the Vietnam War as unwinnable was a turning point because Americans gathered around Walter Cronkite. In this fragmented world, Americans are gathering around no one in particular. So you can have a network like Fox that is seen by 3 million Americans having an extraordinary impact on 300 million Americans and on the political process. And one of the things we still have in Australia is the ability to create a town square where all Australians can come to listen and learn, to speak and to be heard, a place for a collective conversation, and the ABC provides that. And what I find interesting about the States, you know, is that public broadcasting isn't there on television delivering news, but that hasn't saved the American newspaper industry. The American newspaper industry has been hit by circulation declines greater than anywhere else in the Western world. So the argument, the hypothesis that says weaken public broadcasting and the market will meet the need, that is simply not true, because the market would not deliver Four Corners. The market would not deliver Late Line, it wouldn't deliver Foreign Correspondent, it wouldn't deliver the 7:30 report whether we were there or not, because commercial broadcasters are seeking to maximise profit, not fulfil a charter. And delivering serious news and current affairs with bureaus around the world with the kind of investigative work that's required, that is not a way to make profit. That is not a way to maximise profit. So this argument that says, go away public broadcasters, the beautiful market will provide, well, there are some things that are too important to simply leave to the market. And one of those is serious news and current affairs.
Well, I think you could go a little further with that argument and say that you can see what 7 and 9 have done with current affairs over the years and abandoned the principle of robust current affairs with political discourse in it in favour of programmes which chase ratings on the basis of the latest dietary fad and the consumer rip-off. And, you know, that's a legitimate position for them to adopt, but it therefore means that you cannot rely on them. And that point that David talked about in terms of trust, then that's not a trusting environment where they will shift their ground to chase their ratings regardless of the value to the citizenry. The point I'd make about America is, I again agree with David, in the old days you see of Peter Jennings and Cronkite and Rather, the network commitments built again off a pretty robust industry was profound. And you read the commentaries of the day about the amount of investment, the degree of editorial independence, the vigour and trust that was enshrined in those network broadcasts was extraordinary. But since the 90s, their investment has been in decline. And they've been pulling back their overseas bureaus and relying more on agency feeds. And progressively, they, as they come under the commercial pressure, are unable to respond and maintain the level of performance that ensures trust. And so you do keep returning to this principle that somebody has to be, some organisations have to be the custodians of relevant, vigorous, independent journalism. And public broadcasting performs that function both here and in the UK, and I think that is even more in demand in the future than it has been in the past.
I'm really enjoying this conversation because we can keep it rolling, I think, in a very good and useful direction. Anyone really interested in this subject should read, there's a wonderful book by a man called Fred Friendly, written I think towards the end of the 60s, who was the head of head of CBS News, about the creation of CBS News, about the creation of the ethos of CBS News, and about his battles with Bill Paley. Bill Paley owned CBS. Bill Paley was no pushover and was certainly interested in profit. But what Fred Friendly and the people around him were able to persuade Paley was that the profit was synonymous with it being a trusted network. And once that battle was won at CBS, NBC and ABC had to fall into line, because you didn't want to be the untrusted news. So in a way, CBS became the gold standard, and the others did a very, very good job for many, many years of establishing a credibility and authority for US news. Also, of course, the movie Good Night, Good Luck, I think, depicts this extraordinarily well. I'm going to pick up, Jeff, you used the word fragile, which I think is a great word. Now, I would argue, and I think everything I'm coming from at the moment, certainly in Parliament, comes from the notion that democracy itself is quite fragile. We're actually beginning to have to ask ourselves questions which undermine a belief system that certainly I was born and brought up with. With the arrival of Fox News in the United States, the question becomes this: is the United States in 2010 a more mature, informed, responsible society, a more confident society than it was 20 years ago? I would argue that it isn't. And one of the reasons I think it isn't is because of this fragmentation, this fragility that's been thrown into the system by controversy for controversy's sake, by the notion that, in fact, extreme views require an airing. There's a brilliant piece, if any of you want to go online and get it, by Bill Maher, about when's a debate not a debate, when does a debate have to debate because there's two views of something, when in fact he says that in case of climate change, this is the world scientist versus Mr. Potato Head, but it has to be depicted as a debate. I'm sorry to say that in this country, because I think you've probably got your fair share of potato heads, but nonetheless, there are debates and there are debates, and the problem we've got is the commercialisation of news, the agendaisation. I've never used that word before, and I don't think anyone ever will again. But the notion that news can have an agenda attached to it permanently is very, very damaging for the sustainability of the type of democracy that I think Australia is, that I know Britain wishes to be, and that we require. This is the most important thing I'm going to say. We require the US to have those standards, because the US becoming fragile means we become fragile. I'm not sure how long the industrialized, the democratic West would survive with a badly damaged United States. So it's something that's in our interest as well.
The follow-up from that is, I guess, what do we have to do to convince governments of the merits? It seems to us, and we've been to Canberra with Mark and his team and Kim, and we've been to Canberra with Shaun and his team. Even the left side of politics, the Labor Party, are sceptical of the value of the public broadcaster. They've sort of taken on a bit of the agenda of the right. In fact, some on the left are more dry than the right. The previous government, the previous Labor government in particular, what do we need to, and I've said this to you the other day, the UK can point to you. You're in the House of Lords, you've got a high profile, you're a champion of the industry. We don't quite have that back here. We did have a couple of politicians going back in time, Barry Jones. We had a Prime Minister who was also Minister for the Arts at one stage, John Gorton. But we don't have any champions in there, and every time we go to Canberra, we find this resistance, a begrudging, okay, we'll give the ABC an extra 70 million mark so you can do some drama. Okay, well, let's talk about
not that we're critical of that, though.
No.
Rightfully received, yes,
not for a moment.
But I think it does partly go to the attitude, and this is, I suppose, our approach to Canberra. I think you can go to Canberra, and the ABC did this for a long period of time, crying poor, and simply espousing the miracle. It's a miracle that we do all we do on the parsimonious dollars you give us. You should be grateful to us for all that we deliver. Please give us more. And I think if you take that approach, well, then you join the queue of people who feel hardly done by, who are in Canberra with their hat out. And I'm not sure that's a smart way of getting the dollars, quite frankly. Because I don't want to be in a queue behind the universities, behind the research hospitals, behind the pensioners, everyone else who has a claim on the public purse. I think you've got to couch the arguments in terms of what we are in a unique position to deliver that is in the interest of government of the day. We got 3 blocks of funding at our last tri-funding bid. We didn't get the funding that said, just give us more money for being us. We didn't get that. But we got money that said, when we said to government, you've got challenges converting this country to digital television. The analogue switch off is a major, major policy change that affects every household in the country. Let us help you do that. A great way of doing that is creating a digital free-to-air children's television channel, which will also be of educational benefit to the country, help the independent production sector, and be a renaissance for children's television. But we couched to them in their interest, in public policy interest, that was also a benefit to the ABC. Drama was put in terms of what is going to happen as this increasing flood of global content becomes cheaply available here. How will you sustain a television industry that tells Australian voices? What role does public broadcasting have? It was put in terms of a problem to solve. Our ABC Open money was put in terms of the digital divide between the city and the bush and what fast broadband will mean. So I think you've got to go there with solutions. You've got to go there and tell the story of your achievement, but tell the story about what you are uniquely in a position to be able to deliver that is in terms of the need of the government, rather than simply saying, we're great, we're hardly done by. And that's how we reframed it. The ABC ran a campaign on the 8 cents a day campaign, which everybody remembers, people constantly talk about. But the reality is it triggered really the beginning of 20 years decline in real term funding for the ABC. So just going there and saying we're poor, we're hardly done by, we're neglected, give us more, I don't think that's a strategy that works. Government is fundamentally self-interested, and governments back winners, and governments back those who have a story about how they can generate significant public good and tell it in a compelling way.
Yeah, I think your point's true as well, that it would be good if there were in Parliament people who held true to these beliefs. I mean, if you've read David's speech to the House of Lords earlier this month, you see you won't get that level of campaigning, of standing firm and adopting a powerful position. You just don't see that. We are somewhat commoditised, and I agree with Mark, we are kind of stuck in a queue here. I'm not entirely sure that there isn't merit to an argument that says that the underpinning funding needs to be maintained, and the constant erosion of our indexation, which is less than the actual inflation rate, will gradually wear away at the underpinning finances.
I agree with that, but every government department faces that. In fact, most government departments have more of an annual productivity increase cut than we face, and it's hard and very difficult to manage. But I suppose the question is that going to be a compelling argument?
Yeah, I think tactically, I don't disagree with you tactically, although I do think, Mark, that before your time, the fact that your predecessors drove drama down to almost zero level did give you a good basis on which to ask for more money.
I wouldn't recommend it as a strategy.
But I guess SBS is in a slightly different position, is that we do, our charter is somewhat more focused. And I was listening to Margaret this morning and talking about the early years of SBS and the changing attitude. I was thinking about the 2 recent articles this week. The first was that Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, declaring that multiculturalism was dead in Germany, that the experiment had failed, multiculti had not worked. And then I was reading this morning that Australia is the second most multicultural country in the world, using a pretty crude measure of proportions of migrants at 25%. We're second to Luxembourg and equal with Switzerland. But multiculturalism here, I regard, and I'm a migrant as well, I regard it as an extraordinary success. It's completely unfinished business and requires continued investment to make sure that happens. And really what I looked at there was that when Merkel spoke that way, she was really saying the way in which the German nation had approached multiculturalism had failed. And that is to treat migrants as a means of solving labour problems and not investing in them the rights of citizenry and the rights to be included and part of a cohesive, harmonious society. And I look back over the history of SBS and I think that was and is a profound contribution to social inclusion in this country, and absolutely legitimate and, in my view, reason for greater investment in SBS to ensure, because this scenario is not, It's not finished business. This is not a situation where, well, we had all these migrants and they're settled now, everything's done, job finished. Migrant, despite the population debate and how horribly skewed that is to the boat people issue, despite that debate, the reality is that migration levels into Australia will progressively increase. The proportionality of people who come from other countries, who speak other languages, will grow greater and greater. And Australia will face a continued challenge to make sure that all of those people are Australian, are taking an active part as a citizen of Australia. And I think SBS would tie its colours very firmly to that agenda and say, you know, you did achieve a success, probably more than you ever anticipated, certainly more than was you deserved given the level of investment that SBS received in the beginning. But you must not regard this as unfinished business. This is a journey that must be continued. And much the same way, you know, we take a lot of inspiration out of Channel 4 and, you know, and the way in which that occupies a distinctive position in the public service arena. You know, they've got the BBC sitting alongside them. Channel 4 performs a function in innovation, funded totally out of commercial revenue. So there are many models, but we certainly do need continued and growing government support.